How might your life have been different if there was a religion for you? A religion that honored you as a woman, as made equal in the image of God. Welcome to Heretica, her eco-feminist theology podcast. My name is Elena and I am an eco-feminist theologian. Please subscribe at theologyofher.substack.com. How the sexual energy unites us with God, Part 2. Sex is a spiritual discipline. What must be done to bring intentionality and reverence to this dimension of life? In this second part, I will try to answer the above question, making reference to exploring transcendent sexuality from a celibate or renunciate path. To be clear, this path is available to those that are married also. For some, this path may include having sexual relations infrequently, and it does include self-pleasure. So what renunciation may mean to someone is not the same to another. We can't automatically assume orgasm does not exist, although in the strict sense it may seem so. Also, it may be seen as a journey to absolute renunciation, and so orgasm will be a part of that journey. When it comes to the renunciate path, we can feel ecstasy without sexual relations, just by being fully alive in a moment of awe, for example, or as a result of a hug or connection with another living organism. God can also bring us into ecstasy when the mind has reached higher states of awareness, like touching heaven. Getting into the main part of this exploration. The essential eros, the erotic emotion, does not rely upon sexual behaviour or sexual thoughts. Yet, someone on the renunciate path is not free from these thoughts, but tends to contemplate on them to reach their subtle expression and to not be controlled by them. Transcendence thus does not require intercourse or orgasm. As mentioned, intense awe is an emotion that can contain the creative sexual divine consciousness and allow it to flow into transcendence, to be free, to go beyond or transcend orgasm. On this renunciate journey, your sensual and creative sexual side of your human divine nature takes on an existential dimension where it becomes a way of being in the world, one that interconnects you with the whole world around you. It is therefore not a means to an end, but an ongoing transcendent superconscious journey. Beginning in prehistory, in what is known as matriarchal cultures, before the time when books were written and women were predominantly excluded from the pages of history, society was more egalitarian. People enjoyed equal rights. Think Minoan Crete. And women worshipped the goddess through fertility-based rituals. Such religious ecstatic practices continued in the early Hellenistic years where the female priesthoods were in existence, and again, women's participation in religious ecstatic forms of worship had much to do with their fertility. They were women-only, inclusive rituals and took place at specific times of the month or year. Gradually, with the onset of Christianity, and because men found these rituals threatening, as they were unable to understand the mysteries of women's menstrual cycles, the priesthoods were abolished and the rituals were banned. When it comes to religion, there always seems to be an unresolved tension between religion as a form of stepping outside of the normal boundaries of social intercourse, that is, using our sexual energy for transcendence, and religion as a form of reinforcing those boundaries. That is, the sexual energy being only a form of procreation as ordained by God. Early Christian women, though, did maintain such ecstatic practices for a while, and more so followed the celibate renunciate path because they knew that through containing the energy and using it for ecstatic practices, they could have the experience that Mary Magdalene did, that is, seeing a vision of Jesus, or overall a vision of the divine. Paul, in his Corinth letters, gives instructions about the behaviour of the Christian community in which he states how women need to cover their heads as if not to invite these mysterious beings, that is, supernatural beings or angels, into consciousness, which is exactly what women's fertility rituals do. The reproductive energy is offered to God or the goddess, and in this way, she, her divinity, is drawn down to guide through the head the women into attaining liberation or union with God or the goddess. But because they did not want women to be out of control, since the head is the source of control, the source of communication between God and the soul, men wanted to control women's head. So firstly, it was ordered that women wear a head covering to keep them sufficiently under control, and so they wouldn't invite particularly the sexual interest of the angels, as these semi-divine angels were drawn to women whose hair and appearance were adorned and therefore attractive. It was asserted that women should have no authority, exousia in Greek, or power, dynamis, over men, especially the power of seduction, through which they seduce the angels, but also men from attaining liberation. The limitation of seductive sexual potency of women by their husbands was deemed necessary to prevent the entrance or penetration of these sexually aggressive male spirits, who were believed to draw closer to women in ecstatic moments of prayer. Thus, underlying Paul's argument is the belief that woman's natural covering, her glory, can be used legitimately as an object of attraction only to her husband. So the head covering became a symbol of authority and control. Paul's tension with the Corinthian spiritualist or pneumatiki in Greek is that they tended to follow a Greek ecstatic model, which regarded prophetic behaviour as a divine madness, mania, or state possession, katochi in Greek, by a deity. This placed men and women under the control of the god, and they believed that true marriage was to the deity to enable spiritual rebirth to occur. It was precisely the states of possession, the penetration of the bodies of their women, and the possession by another that was a source of great anxiety to Greek and Roman men, and these rites were later suppressed by the Senate, made up of upper-class males, many of whose wives were involved in this worship. So gradually, through the Christian church tradition, the control over a woman's body was of her husband through patriarchal marriage, which made him the relationship. In ancient Greece, the Pythias at the oracles of Delphi had to be formally married women who were required to abstain from marital intercourse during their term of service, the surrendering possession of their bodies to God. Strabo, a Greek philosopher, says that the state of possession, or enthusiasmos in Greek, of the Pythia was caused by the gods entering her, as if sexually. To clarify, such instances of God's possession is not rape by God, as I have seen it mentioned a few times. It is the receiving of God's prophecy, and the deity does not have to be male, it can be female, and this is not sexual intercourse with a deity. Think of it more like you're acting as a channel to receive the divine guidance, so you can experience liberation. The prophetic, inspired, or ecstatic state for women is a form of sexual domination of them, a true possession by the spirit of the deity, and a loss of surrender of the usual social sexual possession of women's bodies by their husbands. And this was something, as I have mentioned, that men feared. And through traditional Christian religious doctrines, they were able to gain control over women's bodies, creating material biological birth of children, much greater than any spiritual birth or liberation for women. Hence, Greeks and Romans spoke of marriage as a mastery or taming of the woman by the man, just as the body and its appetites were mastered and tamed by the mind. In addition to the deity possessing a woman through her head, the sacred breath or the spirit also entered through the genitals. The most potent time for this was during a woman's menarche, her first menstrual blood, which is why Hippocrates described the invasion of the person's body by a deity and menstruation as a disease, and consequently women who experienced ecstatic raptures were deemed as being hysterical, instead of the reality that women were on the verge of a sexual and spiritual awakening and one step closer to union. Taking the Annunciation of Virgin Mary, which in my master's thesis I explored it as being her menarche, where the angel Gabriel announced she would have a divine birth. To me, this indicates this as her time of being possessed by a deity, hence the angel, and at the time of her menarche, which is a liminal space, a betwixt and between, and not here, not there, ideal for such occurrences. Thus, what is prophetically announced is that she will attain liberation and will go through a spiritual rebirth. So we can see the tension between women's own attempts for liberation through ecstatic forms and the control exercised over them by a male-dominated social order, and the perceived need of male authority to reassert control over female sexuality, which is essentially control over female spirituality and the oppression of the divine feminine. To illustrate deeper how this plays out for women, I will outline some instances from Aristophanes' Lysistrata, which I believe illustrates in an interesting way how to elevate the sexual energy, which I will interpret from a feminist theological perspective and by reflecting on my own experiences. Lysistrata, the main character and the wise woman, comes up with a scheme that the women of Greece should give up sex, known as the sex strike, with their husbands in an attempt to force them to make a peace treaty to end the Peloponnesian War. Consider this peace for our purposes to also be our inner peace. Lysistrata boldly encourages all of the women from all the city-states of Greece to join her to do their part to end the war, which lasted for nearly 30 years. Lysistrata says, "Believe me, I've lost a great deal of sleep, tossing this one over." So what she says is that it's kept her awake, contemplating, and she has become aware of this reality. She says, "I've discovered that the salvation of the whole of Greece depends upon us, upon our tits and clits. That's how delicate a thing it is, tits and clits." So what she's saying, by referring to women's reproductive energy, is that it's women's power. And when women harness this power, it becomes a solution to end wars, but also to many social problems we face in the world today. She continues, "Yet, if all the women meet us here as I told them to from Sparta, Thebes, and all of the alleys, and we of Athens all together will save Greece," Lysistrata says, encouraging them to refuse sex with their husbands. So this also shows feminist consciousness raising, whereby the attention is focused on a wider group and cause to benefit women. Think of it as a collective consciousness to create change. Lysistrata continues, "Peace, my dear, peace among men. No longer will a man thrust his spear against another man." So Lysistrata's vision through this sex strike is to bring peace to the earth, which will also cultivate inner peace with our sexual tensions and expressions. Now, if we women really want our men to make peace, then we must abstain as a way towards peace. We will go on strike. Lysistrata reinforces her vision. Lysistrata continues explaining this vision. Absolutely. Look, all we have to do is we simply stay indoors, put our luscious makeup on, naked beneath, our flimsy little blouses, our curlies thoroughly coiffured and plucked, and we just sit and wait for our man. Soldier hubby comes in, seeks us, and immediately stands at attention. He's torn to shreds with lust, but we move back. We simply don't go to bed with him. I can assure you, darlings, peace will be signed before you can say, "Come again?" So what Lysistrata is explaining is the process of arousing yourself sexually, but not having sex, not having the orgasm, yet containing the energy and allowing it to stir up inside of you. This is the way gradually Kundalini energy or the primal life force awakens and ascends upwards. To amplify this, Lysistrata urges women to take a vow. I'll tell you what I think if you like. Let's sacrifice a wine jug instead. Get a huge black cup, put it on the ground here, then get a jug of that lovely wine from Thasos, break it open and swear to the cup that we won't pollute it by adding water to it. So whenever an oath is mentioned, it is usually connected with abstaining from sex and transforming it spiritually. Know that this has to do with salvation and liberation, and how there needs to be a containment of this life force for awakenings to occur, for purposes of seeing a vision and attaining enlightenment. To bind the oath, they will swear on a cup with red wine in it, which symbolizes the Eucharist cup, the red wine symbolizing blood, and the avoidance of polluting it with water may be about not diluting this force and refraining from intercourse. In feminist theology, the Eucharist blood is actually considered to be the first blood of menarche, and not of Christ after his crucifixion, to express the divine potency of menstruation, fertility, and ritual. In ancient cultures, girls would take oaths on their menarche, not to abstain from sex until marriage, but based on the understanding of its spiritual and religious potency, to lead one to spiritual rebirth and liberation, which was more vital than marriage and creating progeny. That Lysistrata is aware of this is because she has potentially gone through such rites of passage or initiations in a young age, which is evident when she says, I, for example, when I was but 7 years old, I was made a temple attendant. Then when I turned 10, I was given the duty of grinding the sacred barley at Artemis's temple and was also one of the participants at the festival, one of the little bears as we call them. I used to have to take off my saffron robe and dance naked in the procession. Later on, of course, when I became a beautiful young woman, I used to carry the string of sacred figs at Athena's procession. That's the great honor that can be bestowed upon an Athenian girl. So these were rites of passage young girls began taking part of from age 7. The playing the she-bear, as it's called for the virgin goddess Artemis, was for girls at their pre-menarche age. Specifically, the prepubescent initiation for Artemis of Broron, known as the Arctia, when young girls up to the age of 10 would play the she-bear and run naked for Artemis, was a pre-menarcheal rite of passage that helps young girls retain their instincts and develop their intuition, prepares them for menarche, and is also the substructure that spiritualizes menarche, which is what provides its potency that leads to divine vision, so spiritualizing the blood. Myrrhina, one of the Athenian women who took the vow, also uses the power of her sexuality to control her husband. She teases him when he thinks that they are finally about to have sex. Running back and forth, she keeps bringing things out that they need in order to deter him from his goal and further her own. Wait here, she says. I'll go get a cot for us. So we can see this interplay of stirring up the sexual energy, which is also something that can occur through yoga practice, through manipulating the pattern of the breath, from breathing very rapidly to slowing it down, and then incorporating mantra and its sacred sound. So all these practices are designed to stir up the energy. And then we sit in meditation, allowing this to integrate, but also for us to contemplate on the thoughts that have been expressed and direct them into superconscious awareness, whereby the superconscious is able to acquire knowledge through non-physical or psychic mechanisms and pass that knowledge to the conscious mind, which is connected with eventually seeing a vision. The stirring of the sexual energy through another can be through your partner or any random encounter that creates that sexual tension. So back to Lysistrata, where the conflict begins between men and women, whereby men light torches to burn the women and women throw water on the fire. This reminds me of the burning of witches at the stake, when again women were trying to live and express the full potential of their inner powers, and men just seemed threatened by them. There is also the interplay between water and fire, the two most potent elements for sexual or kundalini awakening: the fire that stirs the energy to rise, which is masculine, and the water connected to women's fertility. But water also calms the fire when it's burning too much and helps it to settle within the body. Another way to view this interplay is also by connecting it to chaos, the inner war we must go through when these awakenings begin to change our inner environment, like we are trying to reconcile and tame the feminine and the masculine energies. Well then, says one of the male magistrates, has all this womanish pandemonium finished yet? Have they all finished with their lunatic drum beating and the vulgar drunken orgies and their rooftop wailing over their poor little Adonis? Such are the wild, undisciplined doings of women. So this shows men's perception of women's rituals and how they wanted to tame the wildness of women, a very necessary expression for women's spiritual journey to salvation. This is why today many women have spiritual experiences and don't know they are so. And this can result in a spiritual crisis. We have lost as women connection with our rites of passage and our wildness. Lysistrata states, "We shall undo all this turbulence just like we undo the knots in a ball of wool. We simply pick up the spindles and we pull one thread this way, another that way, another this way, another. Simple. That's how we'll get rid of all the knots." So the way I interpret this is that these are karmic knots that we undo to unravel the root cause of everything that is creating this chaos, symbolized by the knots in a ball of wool. And how through the process of sexual awakening, the journey involves these knots dissolving. Lysistrata continues, "But of course, and if you too had the intelligence to undo knots in balls of wool, you'd be able to undo knots in the state as well. This verifies how when we undo our inner knots, then the world around us also changes. As she says, you'd be able to undo knots in the state, meaning the government. How this will essentially result in power shifts and a new consciousness in world leadership for a better, more equitable world. A whole new mentality in how we do things." As we come to the end, Lysistrata says, "Believe me, control yourselves, darlings, and persevere for just a little longer, because there's an oracle about us and it predicts a victory for us. That's if we don't split asunder and begin fighting each other. It would be a sacrilege, my dear friends, if we betray the oracle." So here we see a reference to a destined outcome, favorable for these women to succeed. Hence, we also have a destiny to experience liberation, and we will go through such sexual awakenings. Finally, Lysistrata says, "Now then, since you've brought everything to a satisfactory conclusion, you Spartans can take your women home with you. Each husband stand by his wife and each wife by her husband, and all together let us now show our respect to the deities with a dance, so that we may never ever sin again." So the actions were able to establish peace and led to a more egalitarian sexuality. We can see that even for married women, the renunciate path is required. This can highlight the challenges of being in a marriage when you enter this path, as it will require both to be on the same wavelength to achieve the end goal. There is also an inkling of an understanding that I developed when I discovered the ancient Greek path called parthenogenesis, or divine birth, how it is a path that requires the guidance of a woman to take you there. In other words, it is the woman's path to self-realization, and for men to attain liberation, they need to associate with a woman who has achieved liberation, much like the tantric path. This came to my awareness from reading part of the Apocalypse of Adam, an apocalyptic text discovered amongst the papyri at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt in 1945, which is part of the Gnostic Gospels and dated to have been written around the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. The Testament imparts revelation of the esoteric mysteries and the gnosis or knowledge needed to thwart the archontic powers and return to God. This pre-Christian testament purports to be an ancient account of Adam, the first man, speaking to his son Seth, in his 700th year, about his time in Eden, before the fall and foreseeing the events of Genesis, saying, "Listen to my words, my son Seth. When God had created me out of the earth along with Eve your mother, I went about with her in a glory which she had seen in the aeon. These are intermediaries of the Supreme Being, from which we had come forth. She taught me a word of knowledge of the eternal God. Eve is the transmitter of knowledge and immortality. And the ninth kingdom says of him that from the 9 muses one separated away. She came to a high mountain and spent some time seated there, in meditation, contemplation, or isolation, so that she desired herself alone in order to become androgynous, being both male and female, union of masculine and feminine energies, but even beyond gender. She fulfilled her desire, that means that the Holy Spirit descended upon her, and became pregnant from her desire, an act of parthenogenesis or divine birth. He was born, he being the eternal being. The angels who were over the desire nourished him, and he received glory there and power. And thus he came to the water, the element connected to fertility. So there is a lot of potency connected to women's fertility as mystical and spiritual rebirth, which much of it has to do with her understanding of the power of her sexual energy and how to awaken it. So we can see that Eve awakened her sexual energy on her own just by sitting on the top of the mountaintop and contemplating. And then she shares this mystical reality with Adam. When she does, the two are one, and the outside as the inside, and the male with the female, neither male nor female. This transformation she is able to achieve leads to liberation. Thank you once again for joining me. Please do consider subscribing at theologyofher.substack.com. How might your life have been different if there was a religion for you? A religion that affirmed you as a woman, as equal to man, and made in the image of God. How might your life have been different? Heretica, her eco-feminist theology educational podcast.